I am Charlene Margot, co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, and we are delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Lindsey Cormack, who's going to be talking with us about her new book, How to Raise a Citizen. Please join me, everyone, in a really warm welcome for Lindsey Cormack. Take it away, Lindsey.
Charlene, thank you so much for having me. And Bev, thank you for managing the chat. And Kenya, thank you for doing Spanish interpretation. And thank you everyone who cared to come out to see this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and walk you through this presentation. And I'm going to look forward to any questions that you have at the end. All right. You all should be starting to see a little bit on the front. Here we are. Perfect. So, like everyone said, I'm Lindsey Cormack. The book is called How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It. And before I get into that, I always like to talk about what I mean by the word citizen. I don't mean it in sort of the legal definition or an exclusive definition of who can have rights or access to something and who can't. I mean it more broadly than that. When I wrote How to Raise a Citizen, I'm writing about people who have agency within a political system, people who understand and know how to activate their own power. To me, being a citizen is about being a member of a community, contributing to our shared life, and understanding the governing apparatus that we have in order to engage and support things that we want in the system. So that's what I mean by a citizen. What I'm going to show you is the research that it took to write this book and the recommendations that I have after having done that. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I am someone who is deeply interested in politics, from the smallest local, most personal individual form of politics to the highest, most federalized version of politics. I was on sabbatical for the last school year, and I spent time in New York City sitting down with this little sign that just said, "Will you chat with me about politics for 3 minutes?" And I had a little timer, and people would sit down and do it. And one of the things that I heard the most was, "I don't have anyone to do this with," or "I never feel comfortable talking about this." And people were at first sort of suspicious, like, why would we do this? But then we'd go over whatever issue they wanted. After 3 minutes were up, we'd learn a little bit more about each other, and then I'd wish them good luck and goodbye. So that was something that I did over last year, and it really helped me to know how a lot of people come at these problems. Like we said, I work at Stevens Institute of Technology, which is in Hoboken, New Jersey. It is a wonderful place for me to work, and this book wouldn't have been written without them. I've been there for 10 years, and the students there are excellent. They are so bright. They are so good at doing school, and they go on to great careers. But what I found in working with them is many of them lack the very basic knowledges to understand what their government is or how to participate in it. A part about working at a small school like Stevens is that professors oftentimes get drafted into pseudo-administrative roles. And something that happened to me my very first year was that I was put on our task force of how we were going to get students registered and how we were going to increase civic awareness on campus. I was happy to do this work, but it was really illuminating, and it's one of the reasons I wrote this in the first place. We would have these things called ducks to the polls because our mascot is a duck. And what we do is we take our ducks over to the polls for them to vote. We don't care how they vote. We just want them to be able to exercise their right. And then we go have an ice cream party. Pretty fun, pretty simple. But each time I do this, I have students who are turned away because they're either not registered or they're not registered in that county. And they didn't know that. And after seeing that year over year, it became frustrating. They're so excited to exercise a right that they get when they're an adult. They get to be among their friends. They get to go do this really neat thing. And then they're told, "I'm sorry, you didn't know that 30 days ago there was an invisible deadline that no one said anything to you about, so you can't participate." And I thought, this is not fair and it's not right. My students go to public and private schools, but many of them do not understand the very fundamental basics to participate. And it's not just at my school. New Jersey actually does a really good job of getting their youth registered to vote. But if I know my students are struggling, I knew the story was probably worse elsewhere. The very first project that I did as an academic was this federal project called DC Inbox, which is it's an archive of every email that every member of Congress sends to their constituents in an official capacity. It's something that I thought would be useful for researchers. It's something I thought could be useful for the press and media and just individuals who want to see what are their Congress people saying. It's free, it's open to the public, it's online, and anyone can use it. And I'm so glad that I did this because it's really given me a well-rounded view of politics, how it happens from the left to the right, and an appreciation that everyone's really just trying to make a world in an image that they think is better for everyone else. The first book that I wrote was on U.S. veterans policy. I was also happy for that experience because it really set me up to do this one. I love this book that I just wrote that we're going to talk about tonight, and I think it's something that's so accessible for readers that not necessarily are interested in the academics of political science, but really just want to understand our system better and make sure that their kids can too. Finally, I'm also active in local politics. I'm the secretary of Community Board 8 in Manhattan, New York, which is an appointed position that does things like zoning, liquor licenses, marijuana licenses, street fair regulations, and all these sorts of quality of life things that make our community and our city better. That sort of work is the on-the-ground local politics, and I'm very happy that I've gotten to see politics from a bunch of different perspectives in the time that I've been working in this field. So the first thing I'll say when studying how we know what our students know is it's very hard to get a handle on this. Because the United States has a federalist system, each state gets to decide what it is going to teach in terms of civics and government preparedness to its students. And so this is just a graph that we made that says, at the time, here's the different requirements that are in different states. In doing my book, I had 6 research assistants, and we're going to go over the work that they and I did together. But something that makes this very challenging is that there is no national standard curriculum, like here's what you need to know, or here's how you know when you're registering to vote. There's nothing like that. Instead, every state gets to dictate what their students have to know, and they're not uniform. Some states take a really lax view, some states are better than others, but it's really hard to get a grip on what's taught. Furthermore, when we talk to people in the individual states, they'd say, actually, these decisions don't really happen here. They kind of get devolved down to the school district. And when we talk to people at the school district level, they'd be like, actually, the real decision making happens on whoever's running the school, like the principal, and what sort of resources they have. And when we went to that level, the teachers would say, actually, it kind of depends on what I have time to do in class. So the standards are really varied around the United States. So the things that I'll say will not be true in every state, but I'll tell you what the modal form of delivery is. On average, students in the United States will have one class in their 8th grade year that is going to be something like U.S. history, world history, or social studies broadly. And then the second modal form of delivery is in your second semester of your senior year of high school, you'll get a class that's called government. Some states have year-long treatments, but most of them have half-year treatments in the second semester of your senior year of high school. And I don't know how you all were in your second semester of your senior year of high school, but I know I certainly wasn't in a place of trying to learn a whole bunch of new things, encountering new vocabularies. My head was somewhere else. This is different than how we teach every other subject. In every other subject, we layer from K through 12. We start with little concepts, we build to bigger concepts, and then we move on to projects and advocacy and really engaging in things with a critical way. The way that we teach government and civics in most U.S. states can't do that because we do not afford enough time to this, and we teach it too little and too late. This is one of the key challenges about getting this done in schools. It's a varied system, it's a patchwork, and when we were talking to teachers, there's some other challenges that I'm going to get into in this next piece. Some of the other research that we did is we looked at the nation's report card, or what's actually called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which are tests that are administered on a bunch of different subjects throughout the United States in urban schools, suburban schools, rural schools, trying to get a stratified understanding of how our schools are operating. And what you're seeing on this slide here is the scores that we have for civics readiness in the 8th grade test, which is the grade that we test this in. The red line is what we would say would be a basic achievement level, like the very basic that you'd need to understand what our system is like. You'll see that on average from 1998 until today, it's pretty much stayed the same, and it's all far under what would be considered proficient. There are, of course, variations in different sorts of schools and different sorts of settings, but it doesn't bode well for our politics if we do not understand how our government works or how to interact with it. Additionally, we looked at things like the AP test scores. Now, we know most students do not take advanced placement tests, or most students don't even take the classes. On average, around the United States, only about 2% of our students will take AP US Government. But what you can see here is that the test scores on this are very low, and this is true in any year that you look at it. Despite the fact that every person who takes this test is going to operate in some capacity in the United States, is going to have to understand the government, is going to have to understand their own role in it, on average, they don't score enough to get college credit on it. For most AP tests, you have to get a 3 or more to get college credit, and in the United States, most of the students who take this simply don't. This is an update that was put on Instagram by College Treehouse, which is sort of like a data-styled look at what's happening on schools. And you'll notice that in 2023, AP US Government is number 37th. Only 49% of the people who passed it had a 3+ score, which means most of our students who take this, and these are the ones who opt in, who think they want to learn about this, do not do well enough to earn college credit or be considered someone who understands this subject. We know that this has impacts on how our politics operates. It especially has impacts on how our young people can engage in the system. What you're seeing here is census data that looks at how people are registered to vote over age. And you'll notice that 18-year-olds lag far behind everyone else. Registering to vote is not as simple as it might seem. For a lot of students, it's going to depend on what state they're in, on how they're going to do it. In some states, you cannot do it online, including big states like Texas, which means students have to interact with forms that they're not used to. They have to address envelopes or go to a voting site or a board of election office building that they've probably never been to in order to get this done. Furthermore, in many states, you have to either have a driver's license number or your social security number. And for those of you who have kids who are 16 to 18, you probably know that they don't know their social security number. They might not have even seen that card. And so when we put these sort of hurdles up and say, okay, you got to go do this, you have to go participate, there's a bunch of invisible hurdles that they don't know how to navigate, and it really trips them up. Furthermore, once they leave our house, if they go off to college or if they leave the family home to go work or start a life somewhere else, there's all these other things that are tricky for them. Their minds are somewhere else. They're trying to figure out, where am I going to live? What am I going to do? Am I going to partner with someone? The idea that registering to vote is top of mind simply isn't, because they have too many other things going on, and we as a culture don't necessarily stress this for our young people. When we look at who turns out to vote, it's even steeper. We know that politics feels and functions better when it reflects the people that it's meant to represent. And our politics can't feel or function better if we don't allow everyone to participate. And it's not just about allowing, but it's about encouraging. It's about having a culture that says, if we want things to get better, it is up to us to do this. That's something that I learned when I was talking with people individually about politics. Something that I heard often was that people were like, I don't really like where this is going. And it seemed as if they thought of themselves as like passengers on some ship of politics. And what I always would end up telling them is, you're not passengers, you're the crew. We are the ones who write this system or put it wherever we want it to go, but it's not something that we just go along passively. We have to actively participate. The routes to our civic deficit are multiple, and I go in greater detail in the book, but I want to go over a few of the pieces here. One is, our system is pretty intricate. It's hard to understand. The idea that you can get it done in one semester in your senior year of high school, or even in a year-long or a 2-years-long treatment, isn't true. It's hard. There's layers, there's different offices, there's different rules, but it's not impossible. We learn many different systems in a K-12 education. We learn many different systems in our life. We have a prioritization problem where if we have an intricate design that we're unwilling to get into the details, it's going to be very hard to understand how we ever get out of this. Also, something that plagues the United States is we have a tradition of not talking about politics. I was raised in Kansas. I was raised in a family that never talked about politics. I never went to vote with my parents, and it wasn't until I was in college that I sort of figured out ooh, there's something to learn here. This tradition of not talking has been borne out in etiquette manuals that were proliferated throughout the United States that said, you don't want to make guests uncomfortable. If you yourself are made to change your position, it might look like you're waffly and maybe untrustworthy. And so politics kind of got shunted into this world of there's things that are off limits, like sex or drugs or other taboos like asking about money. Not talking about something doesn't make it better. It only makes it harder to navigate. And so while I understand talking about politics can feel daunting, or sometimes we feel like we don't want to do it because we don't know enough, that's an inhibiting feeling that I think we need to encourage ourselves to get over it. No problems ever get better if you don't talk about them. And I think about it like a medical emergency. If you had a medical emergency and you said, you know what, I guess I can't talk to anyone about this, it's probably not going to get better. But I know that most people, when faced with something like that, seek other opinions. They ask their doctor. They maybe ask another doctor. They ask their sister who's a nurse or their friend who's a PA, just trying to figure out what is happening here and how can I make my life better. The same is true for politics. I kind of think about ourselves as being in a civic crisis, and we don't know how to get out of it, but not talking is not going to be the way to do it. Additionally, our kids look up to us for what we do and what we don't do. And if our kids never see us talking about politics, never see us engaging with a neighbor, talking with a spouse, or being willing to entertain a conversation with them, they learn that they shouldn't do that either, that there's nothing valuable in there, or maybe that it's even distasteful to do it. So they are modeling after us, and they learn by what we do and what we don't do. Related to this, in the United States, as long as I've been able to understand our politics, I know that most of us feel something like hatred toward it. We say we don't want to talk about it. It makes our skin crawl. It frustrates us. It maybe has fights within our families, within our friends. And a lot of us think that there's something that's wrong with politics altogether. I hear oftentimes when I talk to people when they don't know what I'll do, they'll say, politics is the rigged game. It's the dirtiest industry. Everyone's in it as liars or cheats or egomaniacs. When our kids hear that message, it's not surprising that they don't want to learn more. But this is a narrative that we owe ourselves the ability to get out of, because politics is pervasive, politics is inevitable, and I actually think it's really kind of great to be alive in a country that allows us to control our politics, that allows us to say we can pick our destinies by collectively deciding on what we want to do. So I understand why a lot of us hate politics, but I think if we take a step back and realize that politics are necessary, they are inevitable, we might as well figure out as much as we can so we can engage in the system in a better way. That's a good thing to aspire to. It's also the case that our kids get this narrative even if we're not giving it to them. When we look at children's literature and children's media and entertainment, there's oftentimes different characters that represent governmental roles. Sometimes they're helpers like police officers or firefighters or doctors. But if there's someone who's like representing the government in the form of like a mayor or a governor, there's two sort of styles that our kids are usually exposed to. One is someone who's like a bumbling doofus, and that's the good portrayal. And two is someone who's out to do harm to the city that they're meant to protect. They are getting these messages. So we as parents have to actively work to make sure that they're hearing other things, to make sure that they're understanding there are benefits to politics. And the way that I like to tell parents to think about this is if you have nice paved roads, politics had a hand in that. If you have clean water, politics had a hand in that. If you have schools that feel safe, if you have playground spaces that your kids can enjoy or green places for your whole family to enjoy, politics had a hand in that. It might be something at the local level, might be something at the state level or the federal level, but someone got together and said, you know what, it makes sense for our community to have these benefits. And so we need to do the job as parents to make sure our kids know that there's good things to politics too. Finally, there's a problem in the way that our schools do this, and we're going to get into those details now. There are things that schools have been trying, and on average, when I talk to teachers and when my research assistants and I interview teachers, we heard that they know that their kids should know this. They know that they should be teaching it, but there are some really big constraints that face our schools throughout the United States that make it very difficult to do this work. One thing that we face in the United States is legislatures, which are just political bodies elected by us at the state level and sometimes local level school boards, have decided that there are topics that are off limits or modes of education that can't be permitted anymore in schools. The trend is towards things that are more restrictive in some states and others are taking a different approach. But when you talk to people who are education experts and people who say, how can we best teach this? It's through something called action civics, which is children getting into group projects and saying, let's look around our community. What's something that we could fix? Say, for instance, they have like a basketball court, but the rims are all broken. Then they have to go figure out, who should we talk to? Is there a community board? Is there a little mayor? Is there a city council? Is there some commission, like a parks commission? So they have to do that research piece. They have to go figure it out. And then they have to realize that there's a way to approach those people. Maybe they're going to write a white paper. Maybe they're going to make art for change. Maybe they're going to have a social media campaign. But that sort of action civics where you're engaging with the political system in school is something that some lawmakers are saying shouldn't be permitted, and taxpayer dollars should not be funneling kids to talk to any elected officials. I can understand some of the rationale, but it makes it harder for our children to understand how to operate with their government in contrast to their government because they just don't have practice in it. Second, our obsession with the SAT and the ACT makes it very hard to focus on civics and government in schools. Both the SAT and the ACT only focus on skills that are outside of social studies. In the 1980s, the ACT did have a social studies component, but in order to look more like the ACT, it was removed. When we talk to teachers, they'd say, the scores that matter for assessing kids and for assessing our schools are how are we doing on the ICT, how are we doing on the SAT. If there is no component of social studies or civics on that, it's not surprising that it gets squeezed out of a curriculum. It's also the case that if you have kids who are who are dealing with learning loss, whether that be in math or reading or the subjects that are covered, the time is going to go to that, not towards civics and social studies. So there's just not enough time, but there's also this prioritization problem in the way that we focus on our test scores. I'm not going to spend too much time on this here, but it is the case that there's a set of court cases that have really sort of constrained the way that teachers can approach politics in the classroom, some for good reason and some that might be harmful, but teachers know that there are people who are looking at them. There are court case precedents that say there's some things that it's hard for them to talk about because they're afraid of stepping out of bounds. Additionally, when we look at the dollars that we put towards this, for every $50 we spend on STEM, we only spend about 5 cents on civics. We know that if our money is our priorities, we're not seeing it in civics. And oftentimes, the teachers who teach social studies and government have to have secondary jobs at their schools in order to have a full-time pay. The joke that we heard when we were interviewing teachers was that we all know who teaches social studies. His name is Coach. And that's something we heard repeatedly. And now with the nomination of Tim Walz as the vice president, it's interesting to see he too was a social studies teacher who is also a coach. That's a joke that we were hearing for the 2 years that we were doing these interviews. And finally, there's another piece that I know is uncomfortable and that I know points the finger back at us, but is a true thing that we heard in interviewing our teachers, which is parents have a problem here too. This happens throughout the United States, where teachers who want to talk about things, who want to teach even very basics, like for instance, if a teacher said, we're going to talk about the 3 branches today. The first branch is the Congress, the legislature. It's the Article 1 of the Constitution, and so, it's the primary branch. A child might hear that, come home, talk to a parent, and the parent hears, ooh, that teacher doesn't like the president. That parent then goes and flames a Facebook group or sends emails to the principal or sends emails to the teacher themselves. And so despite the fact that the teachers we talked to knew this was important, knew that they should talk about these things with their students, they were hesitant to do so. And this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and Zoom school, when our classrooms came into our homes and when our teachers had so much more oversight from parents. So there are challenges. It's not that schools can't do this work necessarily, and it's not that there aren't bright spots. There are. But it's really hard to get this done if we're not willing to also do work in our own homes. I argue that parents can and they should be the agents of change. One reason is we have the most time with them. We shape the way they dream. If we tell them that it's good to be a leader, it's fine to look into politics, it's okay to be someone who cares about your community, they model that. And like I said before, if we tell them that, they're all liars and cheats and egomaniacs, they're going to hear that message too. And they get enough of that without us adding on to it. Also, children do politics. If you've ever watched kids on a playground trying to figure out rules to a game, or if they're in a role play, who's going to be who, what's going to count, what doesn't, they do politics. They do collective decision making. And they are curious. Something that I hear sometimes is, well, teenagers just don't care about politics. Not so. There's a nationally representative survey fielded by Harvard in 2023, that finds that 77% of kids say that they're interested in these things and that they want to know more. That same survey also found that only 25% of kids have reported that they've had an intentional conversation about politics with their parents. We aren't doing this work, but our kids are capable of learning it. They learn so many other things, and despite the fact that it's intricate, it's not impossible. They learn things that are way harder than this, and they might not even use them as often. You're always going to have to use the skills of understanding your government. You always have to use the skills of understanding how to recognize and exercise your own power. So it's something that I think we should emphasize more in our own homes. No one likes playing a game that they don't know the rules to, and that's something that I see with my college students. They get fed up, they get frustrated, they get defensive because they don't understand what's happening, and that's true for everyone. That's true for me, that's true for adults. If our kids understand the rules of the game, our politics will feel and function better. Things can only get better with more attention. The idea that someone else is coming to save us or our politics will just, reflect our will even if we don't put in any effort isn't true. We have to do this work. Also, I don't know anyone who doesn't want their kids to be as powerful as possible. If you want your kids to be like that, you want them to understand their surroundings. You want them to understand how they can activate their own power in those surroundings. We also want our kids to be healthy. And when we think about the things that plague our kids in forms of mental illness, depression, anxiety, isolation, and loneliness, politics can sometimes be an antidote to it. I don't mean politics in the way of doom scrolling and never just slacktivism or clicktivism. But if you think about local politics, that's something that requires the routine in-person interaction of people. And introducing your kids to that can be a pretty good way to make sure that they have a purpose and they have a sense of what they want to do to make their community better and like-minded people around them to help them realize it. We also want our kids to be successful. And as one of the programmatic pieces of this book, I write about how kids who understand politics are far more attractive candidates to colleges. It shows they care about a community. It shows they can problem solve. It shows that they have pro-social behavior, interacting with new people. And on the back end, they're more likely to contribute to their community after college, which is a very attractive thing for college, no matter the size of it. They also really like it when you have connections with local, state, or federal politicians because those things only benefit colleges. And finally, we as parents benefit from doing these sorts of conversations. We learn about our kids, we connect with them, they learn about us, they bond with us, and our politics can be refined by having more people thinking about it together. I'll give you a quick note on partisanship. Partisanship is inevitable in national politics. That is the truth of the system that we live in. But raising a partisan is different than raising a citizen. I never argue that we should be raising little Democrats or little Republicans. Instead, we just need to be raising little people who understand the rules of the game. I like to think of our kids as being raised to be political athletes, not political fans. And if you were trying to raise a child to be an athlete in a sport, you would do things like teach them the rules, run drills, do conditioning and practice. If you were teaching them to be a fan, you might just teach them the lore of your favorite team or maybe to dislike another team, but that doesn't mean they're ever going to be able to play that game. All of us have to play this game, so we should treat this as raising athletes, not fans. We also need to just give our kids the tools to let them to develop their own agency. The parties change, the ideologies change, the personalities change. But if our kids understand the roots of the system, if they understand the programmatic pieces, they can pick the party that they like. And that's not a failure if they pick a party that's different than us. I understand we all want to impart our values to our kids. That's the whole enterprise of why we have them. But showing that you have a child who has a different partisan preference than you and still having love for them is actually a victory, not a failure. And finally, the research on this shows that parent-to-child partisan transmission is mixed at best. It's about 50-50 on whether you can convince your child to see the world in the same way you do, and then on the other side, they might see it in the entire opposite way. And so it just shouldn't be the goal. It's not the best way to approach this. The best way to approach it is to let them understand their system so that when they confront things, they can figure it out with a rooted understanding of how it works versus, I think this is the party I should prefer. They'll just be better at it. So how do we do this work? The first thing is you just need to be willing. You just need to let your kids know that you are open to having the conversation, that you are okay to learn more. Our kids do not need us to be government trivia experts. They need us to be models of what it is to care about this, what it is to be willing to learn more, and what it is to be willing to have hard conversations. We know this. We just need to show them this as a process. They can then model that for whatever exigencies come their way as they grow up. Something that you can do that's very straightforward and easy is introduce your kids to local politicians. Let them know who does this work. That way you can kind of dispel this idea of like an amorphous government who's off doing something that might be nefarious. It's like, no, it's your neighbor. It's this person who cares about what our sidewalks look like. It's this person who wants to have weeds pulled in our areas. Let them see the spaces of your government. Let them go to the Capitol with you. Think about what it means to be in those places and what sort of power stems from them. I also encourage parents to really check their negativity so that our kids do not just hear us complaining about politics. Like I've said before, they hear this elsewhere. They do not need to hear it from us the whole time. I understand there are parts of politics that are frustrating, but we also need to really look for those bright spots. When we're talking about young children, it's not like you're going to sit them down and read them the Constitution and make sure they know it all. Instead, at that age, it's really about giving them an impression of politics, letting them sort of see the model of what it is to talk about these things. What's that back and forth look like? Introduce them to some of the people, maybe the people in your neighborhood, maybe some historical figures. There's plenty of books, and I link to resources in my website that you can use to get started on this work. At that point, you're building a vocabulary, you're laying the groundwork, you're setting up these things so that they can grow and scaffold like we do with every other subject. When you get to ages 10 to 14, you can kind of introduce more foundations and concepts. And again, I have resources that are listed on my website that can help you do this. But this is so they sort of understand, what is the basis of the United States? How do we relate to our government? What are the principles that underlie this, and why are they important, or should they matter to us? When you get to 15 to 18, things get a little bit more important for parents to be aware of. You really have to put things together and prepare them to leave. And there's a few things that I say they need to know before leaving your house, because it's not guaranteed that they'll learn it from school. And when we were talking to teachers, on average, they didn't know those things. When we talk about how we're going to do these conversations, I have a few things to keep in mind. One is, I think you need to approach it with curiosity. When we're talking with our kids about their own sort of politics, we need to be able to show an interest in their views rather than brushing them off as something they'll grow out of or something that they'll learn when we're older. We need to put our distractions away and be willing to have conversations without a phone in our hands, without a TV blaring in the background, and say, oh yeah, I want to do this with you. I'd like to talk about it with you. We also need to make sure we check our own biases. Our kids do not live in the same worlds that we are living in. The times that they're in, the things that they're facing, the threats, the hopes, the dreams, they're different than the ones that we have. Our own fears are not the fears that they have. And so we really need to just look out for that and say, okay, I understand that we might not see this in the same way. We have different lived experiences. I also think it's important to respect our teens. You have to understand that they're just trying to model you. They're trying to grow into little adults. They're trying to figure this out. So diminishing their views is not going to be a good way for you to engender their trust or their willingness to talk with you about these sorts of things in the future. And also, I think it's important to show them that you care by extending gratitude at the end of the conversations, making time for it, and being willing to come back to things that you might not finish over one dinner, or you might not finish over one commute to school. The questions that I think you should ask when you're talking with your kids about politics are the following. The very first question for any sort of political or controversial topic is, what have you heard about this issue? And the reason that I use this question in my classroom and in my house is it relieves the person who's talking with you from having to really defend a position or justify their own opinion. They just get to set the table with what have they heard. It's also important because they're going to hear different things than you're going to hear. We are all living in an algorithmic diet of media that is individuated. So I'm not going to see the same things you're seeing. My daughter's going to see different things than I'm seeing. And by asking whoever you're talking with, what have you heard? You get to see what it is their inputs are, which means that you're going to be better able to understand all the other things. But they are not responsible for what they have heard or what they have seen or what has been put in front of them, but it's good for you to know what that is. The second question that I like to ask is then, what do you think? So we understand you're going to hear a lot of opinions, you're going to have a lot of different inputs. How do you put that together? What do you think about that? That's the second one. The third one that I like to ask is, what do you know? And when I do this in my classroom, the temperature changes because people say, I can think, and you can get really worked up about something. What do you know? Is, there might be a gap here. I do know some things. I'm not sure I know all of it. But that sort of gives us a period to have like a little bit of reflection and say, okay, there's a difference between what I necessarily think and what I have heard and what I know. And then finally, I like to ask, what more do you want to know about this issue? And that's where parents, we can model this information-seeking behavior. We can say, I don't know everything about this, but you know what? If I knew this other piece, I might be able to refine my opinion or come back to this in a different way. Those are the 4 questions that I outline in the book, and I go into greater detail on why I think they're the good ones to ask. Like I said, when you've got that 15 to 18-year-old time, there are 5 things that your kids absolutely need to know before they leave your nest. And this is so that they can exercise their power, so that they can understand the system and not be overwhelmed by it, and so they can move forward in politics in a way that makes sense for them. The very first thing is voting. Our kids need to understand how to register to vote. This is the thing that unlocks all the other powers, and it's not straightforward and it's not necessarily easy. Every time they move to a new address, they have to re-register. Kids, young adults are really transient, and so it's helpful if they have a parent who's looking out for them and says, like, hey, remember, you know that you're in that new apartment? You should probably update your registration. That's a little thing that we can do. And the first time they do it, make sure we have the documents to help them. Make sure you have their social security card so they can figure that out so they can get it done. Because our 18-year-olds on average are not registered. Another thing that we need to talk about more is the difference between primary and general elections. This is something that we came to after talking to the teachers and looking at the curricula around the United States. We do not cover what primary elections are. If we do, it's usually the presidential primary, and that's the only primary that looks like that. But increasingly throughout the United States, primary elections are where the actual competitive election is. And what I mean by that is registration rates are so different between Democrats and Republicans that by the time you get to a general election, in many parts of the country, it's pretty much decided who's going to win. It's whoever's more registered. But the true competition is in that primary election. The third thing our kids need to know is this concept of federalism, which is simple. There's differences at the state, local, and federal level. They have some shared powers, but there's some things that they don't control. So if your kid's mad about the school time, it's not like he can write the president and be like, my school starts too early, I need to have a later school time. That's not a presidential priority. That's not even an authority that they have. That's something where you're looking at a school board. But the appreciation that different levels of government do different things is something that a lot of our students lack, and they sort of have this like amorphous blob of what government is in their head. Finally, I think all of our kids should have read the Constitution at least once before they leave your house. And you might say, oh, they're going to do that at school. Don't worry about it. They're not. If they're taking AP US government, they might. But even then, that's only 2% of our kids, and they don't always have to read this. Reading the Constitution is not something that you're going to sit down and do in one setting. In Chapter 7 of the book, I go over how you can do this over a longer period of time, what sorts of questions you can ask, and how this can be something that you learn together. Many of our parents today grew up in systems that deprioritize civics. A lot of us feel like we don't know a lot of these things. So going over it with our kids is a way for them to learn, as well as a way for us to learn. The last piece is that I think our kids need to have more practice on how to have hard conversations. And I say this as someone who gets to see young adults that are raised by many different types of families in many different types of settings. They are under-practiced in this. Our online communication spaces are either really affirming or really fractious. But in terms of how to have personal, one-on-one, or small group conversations that might be difficult, that might be on controversial topics, our kids are under-practiced and they don't want to feel uncomfortable or make others uncomfortable. Politics doesn't have to be bad. It can actually be good, but you need to have practice in sitting in that discomfort to make it so. So that's the end of what I have for you today, but I just want to reiterate, be willing, show them, they're looking at you, check your negativity, and know that at different age points, there's different things that you should do for them, but just being able to go into the conversation at all is the best thing you can do as a parent. Charlene and Bev, I am looking forward to whatever questions people have.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Cormack. That was absolutely the clearest discussion of politics and what we parents can do to support our kids that we have ever heard. So thank you.
Thank
Plus,
you.
we're getting some nice emojis to prove that. And really good questions coming in too. Keep them coming, people, but these are great questions. All right, Professor, let's start easy. Here's someone who asked if you could please repeat your definition of being a citizen.
Sure. Here's how I think about it. I think about it as someone with agency within a political system, someone who understands how to activate and use their own power. It's about being a member of a community, contributing to our shared life, and understanding the governing apparatus in order to engage and support or oppose others within the system.
Okay, well said. We have some people online with us tonight who work with immigrants and people who are trying to help get people registered. So it's been a really important discussion. All right. In your book, Lindsey, you write that at its core, raising children is creating the next version of society. Can you explain more about what you mean by that and how it guided you wanting to write this book?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think that when I talk to parents today, many of them were raised where they thought that they didn't need to think about politics, or it was something that was like not cool to do, or that someone else was going to take care of. And I think we're seeing how that's playing out. I don't really know that many people that feel good about how politics feels right now in the United States. And that's not going to change unless we decide to change that. And so if we want our kids to have a politics that they understand, that they can contribute to, that they can change the outcomes, we have to prioritize this and show them that talking about it is good, talking about it is cool, and it's a value that we should all aspire to versus thinking that's for someone else to do.
Okay, thank you. Really well said. Okay, this is a longish question, but I think it's worth asking. So here we go. Writer says, my freshman daughter hears us and others talk about politics off and on, and she sees viewpoints in social media and from her friends. Recently, she broke down over fearing that a certain candidate would become president, and she's afraid of what that might mean for women's rights in our country. What advice do you have for balancing informing and talking about political viewpoints with the real concern that it sometimes causes anxiety?
Yeah, this is a great question because a lot of times it does cause anxiety, and I understand these anxieties from the college students that I talk to. Something that I think is very important to put in the context of this is while we are in a presidential elections that feels high stakes, we are also having 435 House races that are happening as well. We have 34 Senate races that are happening. And that's something that I talk to my students about. Right now, it's all eyes on the president. But when we think about what happens in the actual functioning of government, the legislative branch can either be the check on the president or the supercharger. And so you might not get the outcome that you want at one level, but it's important to not lose sight that there are other pieces of this, and those are all happening concurrently. And so I understand that it's frustrating, but I think sort of broadening the scope allows you to see that there's other pieces that can either check against this or supercharge if you do get the outcome that you want. So those are important to consider as well. Additionally, state politics is where a lot of these quality of life decisions happen. If we think about things like access to reproductive health care, or access to firearm licenses, or access to things like legalized marijuana, things that young people tend to care about more than others, most of that politics happens at the state level. Despite the fact that the rhetoric is going to be up at the federal level, the reality is those are state level decisions. And so if those are the politics you care about, are anxious about, frustrated about, that's where to look, how to see to pull those levers and change it there.
All right, thank you for that. And Lindsey, I know that while many schools have school governments, not all of them do. Do you suggest it's a good thing for kids to get involved in?
Absolutely. School government is like student government or student council, however those sorts of things are set up. Those are really good practice training grounds. But if your school doesn't have that, that's a political decision. That is something where that's a parent-teacher association that makes a decision or a school board that makes that decision and says, you know what, we're going to do this. Additionally, a lot of cities are trying this new sort of idea of a youth commission, which is people who will sit up on a board that will either talk to the mayor, talk to the governor, talk to a town council, a town manager, and they'll be able to say, here's the things that we need because we don't have formal representation. We can't vote. And so if you don't have something in your schools, looking or asking for something like a youth council can be another way to sort of activate power and let kids practice.
Okay, that's really interesting. We have a situation locally where we've had students running for this high school boards. And while we believe in participation and all that, it's also tricky to have a 19-year-old sitting on a school board.
I mean, I guess it's tricky. It depends. They are the ones who are going to
Yeah,
be sitting under
yeah.
those rules. I don't know that I would see that as tricky. There's an experience question, but if it's permitted, if that's the age that you can get in there, I'd say more power to the young people doing that.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Thank you for that. All right, this question I know is a big deal. I went through this with my kids every time they moved in college. You touched on it, but let's ask again. Parent asks, if my 18-year-old if my 18-year-old is registered to vote and submits a change of address form at the US Post Office, will a vote by mail form be sent to her at college?
That's actually an incredibly tricky question. It depends on what state you are in for a lot of reasons. One is it depends on if you have an absentee no fault state or not. So if you have to like say why you can't be in person, why you're going to have it by mail or not. It also depends on the deadlines. But what I would encourage people to do is if you have children who have moved away for college, they should register to vote where they live at the college, not at your hometown. And there's a few reasons for this. One is it's incredibly hard to convince a college student, especially 2 months after school started, to go home on a Tuesday. Oftentimes they do not get school off or classes canceled, and so it's just a pain. They also are not that good at deadlines and they're not that good at mailing things. And so we want to like play to their strengths, which is like things that have fewer frictions in the system, they are more likely to do. So I would encourage your child to register where they live and use that address.
Uh-oh. Lindsey, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
But now I can. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. Keep going.
Oh, no, I think I finished up.
You
I'm
finished
sorry if
that
it
now?
got cut out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So just to recap, you're suggesting that they should re-register in the college town when they arrive.
Absolutely, because they're going to be there for 50% plus one of their days. They're going to spend 9 months there usually. That's where their politics happens. That's where local things affect them. And it's far more likely that they can turn out to vote because there's less friction in the system. It's closer to them. It's easier. They don't have to remember as much. And so that is always my recommendation.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. Um, Here's another good question. Can we as parents just send the California ballot to our kids at their own schools so they can fill it out and mail it back? My daughter knows the senators here and doesn't want to vote in a new state.
So, technically, yes, you can do that. And California has a mail-in ballot style that is unlike many other states. So, if they are still registered at your home address and they're living somewhere else, you can get that mail there, forward it to them, and have them send it back. It's just adding in steps to the process. So, I understand why parents might do that. I understand why you might want to do it, and it's certainly possible for you to do it. It's just not what I would recommend.
Okay. Here's a question that came in Spanish. I'm going to ask it in English and then Kenya will translate. How can I explain to my daughter, who's an adolescent, that my son has a different political party than we do?
I'm not sure that that's actually that difficult. You can have them all sit together, and you can sort of ask them like what they think about the parties, what they've heard about the parties, and then describe why that party resonates with them or not. We know that there's a lot of gender breakdowns on what parties appeal to what sorts of voters, and so it's not necessarily a bad thing or doesn't have to be a hard thing. And that's something that you can counsel them on to be like, look, we're not going to see everything the same. Our lives are going to be different, and it's okay to love someone who has a different political affiliation from you. They might have issues that they really disagree on and that are very hard, and those are conversations to have. And you're not going to get agreement on everything, and that's just part of this life.
Well, and you say that we should start political conversations early with our kids. You know, we've all heard that don't talk about politics at Thanksgiving, but you're really saying that's not a good taboo in this country, is it?
It's not at all. I went on a family cruise with my family together this summer, all of us. And my parents have 3 adult children. We were having dinner, and my brother wanted to talk politics with me, and I thought it was totally fine. And my dad took him aside later, and he was like, "Brett, you really shouldn't do that at dinner. That's going to be a problem." And I was like, "Dad, this is actually a problem. If we can't talk politics with the people we love, with the people that we're the closest to, with the people who are going to value us, then how are we ever going to talk politics with people we disagree with or things that we are having harder challenges on? We need to be able to do this practice in our homes, and it doesn't have to be fractious, but that takes trying, that takes repeated interaction, that takes doing it. And the idea that it gets better by not talking just isn't true."
Yeah, really good point, Lindsay. Really good point. All right. So here's kind of a similar question. You've touched on this. What are the benefits, not just civic centered, of helping children to become more active and informed citizens?
There are so many. One is it allows them to see the world in a perspectived way where they can understand that it's not just them, that there's many other people who are out doing this work. When we talk about things that like plague our children, anxiety and depression, oftentimes those are rooted in hopelessness and helplessness. And if they feel that way because, maybe they're seeing things online that everything's really dire or they can't do anything about it, they're going to feel that way continuously. If we can show them that they have agency, that there is an ability for them to change things, that there's an ability to work with others to get a collective outcome that you want, that cuts against that feeling of hopelessness and helplessness. And that's true even if they have an issue that they don't win on or that they don't get the outcome on. The process of going through how can you do this and actually trying lets them feel efficacious. It lets them understand that they are capable of doing things even if they don't get the full outcome. Additionally, when we think about things like apathy or isolation or loneliness, those things are all tied up in being by yourselves and not sort of understanding your place in a greater system or your purpose within a greater system. Local politics are usually not partisan. Usually they're about something where like you want sidewalks in a place that doesn't have sidewalks, or you'd like to have a nice grocery store if you don't have that in your neighborhood. That is not a Democrat or Republican issue, and so it doesn't really get into all those like polarized or inflamed arguments. It's programmatic. It's something that you can do, work towards in a way that lets you kind of get over this apathy, kind of build a resilience to saying like, okay, we can do things together. Additionally, this college point, I can't really overstate it. Colleges want kids who care about things. They want joiners. They want people who know things. They want people who try to do hard things. They want people who are community oriented. And so if your kids understand, participate, volunteer at either like a local politician's office or on a campaign or for an issue they care about, that is a good signal to a school. And most school admissions officers aren't going to say, oh, I don't want someone who's on this Democratic campaign, or oh, I don't want someone who's on that Republican campaign. They understand that the signal is in doing that work at all, not necessarily what that outcome is. And so there are so many benefits in your own sort of like mental health for your children, but also setting them up for understanding how they operate within the system and making them more attractive to colleges.
Those are really good points, Professor Cormack. You know, one of our favorite guests is Dr. Kendall Bronk from Claremont Graduate University, and she studies purpose. And she said there was a huge upswing during the pandemic of students and young adults wanting to talk about purpose. And I think this feeds into your talking about agency as being so key to anxiety and feeling purposeful, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Oh, I love this question. Why do you think preparing our children to be engaged and active citizens is such an overlooked part of parenting?
I think the easiest reason is that for most of people who are parenting today, it was overlooked for them. We didn't have a lot of robust models for doing this. We didn't have schools that prioritize this. And we are sort of the first generations of people to be able to recognize this and fix it. Many of the people who are parents today had women who were not as empowered as women are today. And when I think about who sort of does this social glue, who sort of does this change work, it is women. If you look around PTAs throughout the United States, that work is done by women. That's like volunteer community, making your lives better. And now I think it's time to take it to like the next level, which is like leveling up to government things. And so it's up to us as parents, it's up to us as moms to do this work. And I think a lot of us just didn't have models for this because it truly wasn't taught as much in schools and our parents didn't engage in it themselves.
Yes, absolutely true. All right. You've touched on the importance of politics, local politics in our daily lives. But can you give us a few hints about how parents can encourage their kids to learn about and participate in their local government at any age level?
Yeah, so something that I think can be hard about these things is oftentimes these are seen as adult spaces. I had the benefit of when I moved back to New York City, my daughter was then nearly 2, and our city council member would have these things where he'd say, like, what's the state of the district? And it would be like an annual thing where he'd say, like, here's what we're working towards, here's our little failures, here's our setbacks, here's our successes. And something that he did was he said, you know what, I'm going to have part of my office's budget pay for childcare so that people can come to these things if they have kids. And that's something that if that was more routinized or normalized across the United States, we'd have more young parents who could be involved, but you'd also have kids who are put in this setting where they're hanging out with other kids whose parents care about this. Children are usually allowed in every one of these meetings. They might not always find them interesting, but exposing them to it, having them come see that is not just good for them, but it's very good for the people who are doing the decision making. Because oftentimes, politics happens in spaces without children, which means their interests are overlooked. It also happens in spaces without young parents on average because they're pulled in a million different ways, and so their interests are overlooked. So it benefits our kids to see the practice, to see the people, but it also benefits those people to see our kids to know that they need to make decisions with them in mind.
I think that's really important. My granddaughter went to her first political event at 6 weeks, and they continue to take her out and just do things that are community based and political. And I think it's really great. I think it works.
It also is something that kids, they kind of like. So, like what I was saying, I was on this cruise with my family. My little niece, who's 7, she was like, Aunt Lindsay, who's my mayor? And I was like, I don't really know because I don't live in her town. I said, we could find out. We went online together, we looked up who her mayor was, and we sent him an email. She sat right next to me, and we said, you know what? I'm going to be in your town in September. My niece would like to meet you. Can we set it up? And within a week's time, he wrote back to us, set it up, and myself and my niece are meeting her mayor tomorrow. And she's looking so forward to it. She's been telling everyone that she's going to meet her politician, and she doesn't, quite understand the pieces, but she's looking for it, and I know it'll make an impression on her.
That's so great. That is a great story. We should
I'm
all
excited.
that. I would be excited too. Yeah, do you have your hand up? Do you mean to have your hand up? Yes, no. All right. Lindsay, this has been so wonderful. I have one final question. We've come to the end of our time together. Parents, when we log off, we have a little survey that's going to pop up. We hope you'll take 30 seconds to do it. All right, final question. Great question because you wrote it, Lindsay. What is the one thing you want readers to take away from your book?
I want them to take this on. We can do this. We do so many hard things. Our kids do not need us to be political trivia experts. They need us to show them that it's okay to learn more and that we're willing to have these conversations. That's the only thing that I hope people can take. And the book is set up where I say, here's the problem, here's how we got here, here's how we can fix it. And then the second half is essentially a primer on little government pieces so that you can go into these conversations with more confidence and understand where to find out information if you don't already know it.
Oh, Professor Cormack, thank you so much. And parents, the book is every bit as clear as Dr. Cormack has been tonight. It's not a huge book. It's a modestly sized book, but so clear and so fantastic. So again, Lindsey Cormack, thank you so much for everything tonight. And parents, thank you for coming. Caregivers, those of you who work with kids who are going to be voters, we appreciate you all. Take care, everybody, and hope to see you again soon. Good night.